Has this person been given enough space for ownership of their task? And that sometimes means allowing for a little bit of failure initially, because ownership sometimes means the safety to try, but I own it. If I get it wrong, I will try it again. And ownership is often about allowing that little bit of space for growth. So you will all have, if those of you who have children know, 3-year-olds do not do their tasks well. But if you don't give them ownership, they will never do the tasks. If you take that ownership away, you take away their opportunity for growth. The second thing is encouragement. And the encouragement doesn't mean running in and doing the task for them. It means standing by and telling that person, I believe that you can. What else do you need? Then there is expectation. So really holding the expectation that the person will complete the task. And then lastly, there is accountability. So if those things are in place, and something is still not happening, we do need to be brave enough to have the accountability discussion. And then when one moves into that accountability space, there are a couple of things to review. So the need for correction, whatever type it might be. And I've used the word correction rather than discipline because it just feels a little bit appropriate. Kelvin, do you want to mute there? So when one's looking at, it's still not. All right. So when one's looking at, thank you. When one's looking at, okay, this thing really now needs to be corrected. We now actually have to move into this accountability discussion. In that space, it's also important to really run through the following steps in your mind. Has this task not been completed due to an external force, something external to that person's locus of control that has happened and that has prevented them being able to complete? Is it due to error? So they tried, but they got it wrong, which is a mistake. And that needs support with understanding the error. That just needs support with understanding and providing alternatives, correcting the error. Am I still muted?
We can hear you, Robyn.
Okay, it just said on my side I was muted. Then there's moving on. Is it neglect? So is it that the person just neglected to do it? In which case there really needs to be a firmer conversation about understanding the consequences of that neglect, both for the task and for the person themselves. And then lastly, is their intent? So there was that malicious. And only when it gets to the point where there is malicious intent do we move into a more disciplinary process. So this framework, I think, is very helpful for providing some steps around thinking how to manage the deliverables that we all have to take care of. All right, then I'd like to just speak quickly about the second concept of holding space, which is holding space for the collective. And in terms of holding space for the collective, there are a couple of, he really wants to be present on the call. There are a couple of really helpful items to think through. So team meeting spaces are a very powerful way, potentially. They cannot be, but if you hold your meeting space correctly, it can really be a place that starts to generate relationship, trust, and safety, and starts to create a ritual, a safe ritual that your team understands and that they can expect and know, that will allow them to generate relationships and move through their achievements that they need to focus on. So the first thing in terms of meeting spaces is the concept of place. So staff room is a place. Make the place nice. If you don't have that kind of space, or that's not the kind of team that you lead, to have a routine space and place where you meet, and for that place to be welcoming to human beings. So something as simple as flowers in a room, tea in a space. Mr. Professor, thank you. Something that welcomes people in, a seating arrangement that promotes connection. So those of you who've been through Partners for Possibility understand this concept of thinking circles or thinking space between people, reducing the hierarchy by really creating circular seating arrangements rather than, you know, the boss at the top and everybody else sitting at rows like in front of them. The other element that is very helpful is routine. And we're going to talk a little bit about routine now. So the routine is really the predictability about how this meeting space will run. That when I walk into a room, for instance, if it's a staff meeting, I understand when I walk into that room, I have an expectation around how I will be received and what I'm going to experience in that space. And I'm not caught off guard. That done consistently over time generates a lot of safety and a lot of confidence. So this concept of temenos is an ancient Greek, temenos is an ancient Greek word which describes a phenomenon that's known from ancient human times. And temenos speaks to the concept of safe, sacred space. And it's a beautiful concept because it helps us to understand this is what we as human beings need to connect: safe, sacred space with ritual or routine. What is very helpful also is when people come into that room, come into that space, there is an expectation that they will come. You don't come if you want to and not come if you can't. We understand who's coming. If you can't come, you're clear about that you can't come. When we arrive in that space together, to have a moment of landing or grounding, which can be as simple as you sit down, you sit together, and it doesn't have to be the leader always who does this, but somebody in that group is asked to lead an exercise in grounding, which can be literally sit still, close your eyes, take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and let's land in this space together. And what that does is it just separates us from all the chaos and the busyness that we sometimes walk into these meetings from, and it allows us to land into the space, and it allows us to be present. The third thing specifically, sometimes again, and you can find allies in this, so you find people who actually have a very high awareness of what the energies are in a room. But as a leader, to cultivate this for yourself as well. So to cultivate the understanding of what are the energies within a room, and an awareness of what are the conscious awarenesses in the room. And generally, this is what everybody in the room is kind of aware of. And then what are the unconscious elements in the room? Things that are not spoken, things that maybe haven't been heard, but that are driving the dynamics in the room. And it's a really powerful thing if you grow your awareness, specifically as a leader, but you can co-opt others to help you with this, to start to drop this this kind of tide line between the conscious and the unconscious, and to bring more of the things that are driving difficult dynamics into the group consciousness so that they can actually be addressed. And there's a whole session on that at some point. The third thing is this concept of presencing. There are many ways of creating a presencing capability in a meeting. But again, for those of you who have been through Partners for Possibility, the time to think model is a very powerful presencing model. So it's really attending to these elements, and hopefully the slides will be shared with you so that later you can look at them in more detail, but attending to these elements within the meeting room. These are kind of all space creation. Then getting into what actually needs to be discussed in the meeting, because sometimes there are very clear agendas and things need to be discussed. So getting into that agenda component, clarity. So being explicit, very clear, even when things are hard. Removing yourself from the emotional hardness and being able to be clear about the things that need to be discussed, but not being clear and then cutting it off. So being clear and then cycling that with the opportunity for the group to contribute and think together. And what that does is it helps to lower the tide line between the conscious and the unconscious, but it also helps to really bring on board the team into discussing the issues, and to help the team to take ownership. Then there's a really important component towards the end of the meeting. So before you close the meeting, to consciously pause and ask for reflection. And there are lots of ways to practice reflection. So it doesn't need to be public. You can ask people to reflect, have 60 seconds of quiet to reflect. You can ask people to write. That can be either public or private. So if it's difficult issues, it can be private writing that people don't have to share. Or if it's something that the group needs to think through together, you can share that. Or you can have verbal reflections. So let's reflect together on what's happened in this meeting, on what we think. And this is an extremely powerful moment, because the truth is everything that goes beforehand is information in. Until we stop and reflect, we don't learn. And so this quote from John Dewey, that we do not learn from experience and we do not learn from being told. We learn from reflecting on our experiences, and we learn from reflecting on what we've been in conversation about. The last thing is to close that meeting and close it properly. Close the container. So in the same way as you landed into the room, consciously close the meeting so that when people step out, they can almost step from the meeting space back into their daily activities, and that space is contained. So that's just a reminder of those steps. There are quite a few there. The most important are really conscious opening, grounding, presence, paying attention to what's going on in the room, and then whatever you have in terms of your meeting, the reflection and the clear closing. So building on that, this that we've all discussed is really what I like to think about it as, is about how do we go about crafting a school culture. So we all know school culture is key. How the hell do you create it? This is a way of creating school culture. So I've borrowed this quote. It's a quote which another colleague of ours, Whittaker, spoke about recently in terms of some healing histories works that we were doing, and we were talking about trauma. And I've just modified it slightly. So it's this concept that our stories layered over time in the context of community or of a group are what become experienced as our culture. So it's developing consensus about what our stories are. And so how do we then shift our culture? We start to pay attention to the stories which we tell ourselves and each other day by day.